Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with Don Campbell. Don Campbell is a partner at Founder Partners, a firm that invests in and helps build early stage startups. And prior to that, he helped lead the venture accelerator at Ford Motor Company and was also a co founder and CEO of GatherUp, a company that helps businesses better leverage customer feedback and online reviews. Today, we're going to talk to Don about some of the challenges startups face when it comes to shipping better quality software. Welcome to the program, Don.
Hey, Chris. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So Don, I thought if it's all right with you, I'd love to start with your experiences as co-founder and CEO of GatherUp. What would you say was your initial approach to quality, and how did it change over time?
Yeah, well, I think like many startups, we were just running fast to build an MVP and get something in customers' hands. And so there was a lot of a lot of sprinting involved to get there. And then once people started using the product and they were starting to pay for it, um, then you're just building, right? There's so many things that and just the typical backlog that every uh, you know software company faces. There's all these features that you want to add to the product and that are coming from customers. They're coming from the founders. They're coming from the support team and what we're seeing out in the industry. So yeah, so we were running fast, and we had good engineers, but the quality of the product at some point started to suffer, and our support team was sort of like the our we call our customer success team. They were very good, and they were our early warning signal that we were getting more and more bugs that were affecting the customers, and so at some point we had to literally pause our development because we had, no sort of coordinated testing process. We had the developers would do their best to unit test and things like that, but we didn't have, as we grew to more engineers, to more customers, to a bigger product, we didn't have a coordinated, testing process. And
So,
yeah,
yeah. So when you started out, did you start out with test automation? Were people writing unit tests from day one, or was that something that came later on in the process?
no, they were writing some tests, but only like for the using like the library within whatever JavaScript or PHP library or whatever they were using had some test. They would use a little bit of that, but there was nothing that would do a coordinated test of the whole product.
Mm-hmm.
And as more components of the product started coming together, that started to affect us.
Yeah. Yeah, so what was kind of the early warning signal of when did it feel like, okay, now this is a problem that we think we need to start addressing?
Yeah, well, we just started having more and more issues with customers, and our customer success team was they're pretty proactive, so they were involved in our product discussions a lot, and they would bring us and say, look, this one problem, if you could eliminate that, would save us like so many hours a week. So they knew
Mm.
where the big items, and we just started seeing more and more of them. And so that's the time when we got to the point. I mean, our company was based on customer experience. Like, we helped other
Mhm.
companies deliver a better experience to their customers and find out how they were doing it. So we had to live that ourselves, right? And
Yeah.
that's we
Yeah.
believe in that, which is why we did the company. So we were like, we took it very seriously and said, look, we can't be doing this. Number one, to our customers, and number two, to our support team, which is starting to
Mhm.
drown in these issues.
Yeah, I think it's amazing the tight relationship between QA teams, development teams, and the customer support or success teams. They're really customer success teams are really the front line when it comes
Yeah.
to understanding the customers and how they're really experiencing things. And I've seen sometimes when there's no line of communication between your customer success team and your engineering team, sometimes they're experiencing quality issues all the time and they're just masking them from the team. So they come up with these workarounds of, okay, here's how we get the customer what they want. The
Yep.
customer's still having a terrible experience and nobody on engineering has any idea because the customer success team is just using workarounds to make the problem go away. So I think it's really interesting to pay attention to what those support teams are doing.
100%. And it's interesting. I mean, important also to make sure that they know that we want to hear those things. I think a lot of you, to your point, a lot of customer success teams are, if a company treats them just like support, like, okay, just go do support, then their job is to just handle those problems. But if they feel like they're part of the overall process, like I always thought our customer success team was on the same level as, of our sales or engineering team or any of the teams, because they're the ones interfacing with customers all day, and
Mhm.
they felt empowered to come back to us and say, hey, these are the issues, and and so that they're not just masking it, they're bringing it back, saying, here's how you can improve the product. This is super important.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. So when you started to realize that there were these issues, did you have any QA team at all? Did you have a manual QA team? And if not, who was responsible for doing whatever testing was happening?
Yeah, so we would have, after we had a new release, we would we had like a staging server, and then our customer success team would do the testing. They would
Mhm.
test it,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was just like a more of a run through. It was not a full on test, so we didn't have a separate team for it. And um, my philosophy back from working at bigger companies. So I've worked at Microsoft, I've worked at Ford, and then I worked at a internet startup that I joined. That was when it was early. There's 30 or 40 people, and it grew to 1,000 people. So I saw that hyper growth. And there I was doing a lot of product management, and what I saw was, you know, I saw that testing, and love to hear your thoughts on this, but
Mhm.
testing isn't just like, okay, let me throw it over the wall to the QA team, because that's what I had seen, and that doesn't work very well. I'm not saying a QA team doesn't work. I just mean that when the culture is, okay, I'm going to write some code real fast and throw it over to QA and then we're good. I wanted everyone to be involved, like our engineers to be involved in testing the code that they ship. They should be proud of what they shipped, and it shouldn't have bugs in it, right? It's not just
Mhm.
like they're prima donnas that don't have to care about that stuff.
Mhm.
And so I think that, to me, like, good QA is something that everyone along the chain has to think about. And then, of course, you got to test it all together. But anyway, I was trying to get it so that we had our engineers were thinking about it, the CS team was thinking about it, and we would
Mhm.
go in and test sometimes, that me as the founder, I would test stuff. So um anyway, I think that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important trend that's happening these days. A lot of times it's referred to as shift left testing, where it's just how much of the testing can we do before things are merged, before they're deployed, before they're promoted, before they make it into production. And so the earlier in the process you try to do more testing, generally the better results you get. And I think that's a good lesson for us to learn, not just from the QA aspect of it, but also the customer success aspect of it, the product management aspect of it. I'll give you a concrete example. I was at a startup where we were getting started with test automation, starting to roll everything out. And, we didn't have all of our test automation in place yet. We didn't have great coverage. That's part of what we were working on. But every release would go out, and literally within 30 minutes or an hour, if that, somebody from the customer success team would say, "Hey, here's issue one, two, three." They would just start finding all of these issues. And so we just said, well, hey, what if we have them do the same thing that they're doing in that 20 minutes after the release goes out? What if we invite them to our QA environment and ask them to do the same thing in their QA environment? And so we would deploy to QA, and then we would say, hey, customer success team, this is the version that's about to go into production an hour. In an hour, treat it just like you would the production release. And sure enough, every time we deployed to QA, they'd find their one or two issues, and we would just fix them before the release, right?
Nice.
And so, as we can shift more people earlier into the process and, get QA teams, get success teams, get product management teams involved in not just the testing, but also the how do we plan on testing this, or what should the requirements be, or hey, give
Yeah.
us some feedback on this thing before the developers merge it. uh, that's usually the least expensive time to
Yeah.
have the most impact, and that's going to end up with higher quality results all around. So,
Yeah, agreed. And because those people, the further, I guess, the further left you go in your example, like the closer you get to the source, they know more about the code that they're deploying, right?
mhm,
And like I always remember from my days programming about exception handling. Some developers do that well and some don't. And so some of it too is like a cultural thing where you have to make sure, or at least in our case, just had to make sure everyone knew I would rather ship slower and quality than faster and not quality. Like take
mhm,
even if you have to tell me my development schedule was impacted, I want you writing those exceptions. Like I want to know if something happens. I want intelligent error messages for the customer. I want, test harnesses in place. And that has to come from the leadership too, right?
mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's a whole, that could probably be an episode on its own, is the whole speed versus quality conversation.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's a myth to think that you have to sacrifice speed in order to get quality, or vice versa. Um, because what I've seen is, it's kind of like, if you're trying to win a Formula One race, if you don't stop to change the tires and
Yeah.
change the oil, you're not going to have the fastest car on the track, right?
Right.
And software is very much the same way. If you don't address the quality of the software as you're going, if you introduce too much technical debt, if the design of the code isn't keeping up with the changing requirements of the day, over time, these quality issues are going to just slow you down, and you're going to be the one who's out on the track with a broken car and smoke coming out the back of it,
Yeah.
because
Well,
you didn't address these issues. So I think that's really important, even for startups, to think about from day one, is how are we going to make sure that, yes, we want to go as fast as possible, but we need to do it in a way that we don't break down or damage customer relationships and things like that.
yeah, because like it's part of your customer experience of your product.
Mhm,
Right? It's like the right good error messages or nudges or lack of bugs and failures is like part of that. So it's really important. And like I saw a video recently that to your Formula One analogy, it was like it showed 20 years ago, like when they would come for a pit stop and change the tires out and everything, it took like almost 30 seconds. And then they
mhm.
showed a current one where the guy comes, pulls the car in, and they have the tires off, back on within like 3 seconds. They're out on the road, and I think
Wow.
that's because they developed an infrastructure to do that over time, right? They said, "Hey, we want to still go fast, but we have to have integrity of the vehicle, or else we're going to lose the race." And
Mhm,
so they had to build the systems, right, to do the quick change and all that. But once they did
mhm.
that, built that system, now they can move really, really fast. So that's kind of back to your thing about it's a myth to say you can only move, you know, you can't move fast or have it's like
Mhm.
I can't remember how you said it, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah. So what would you think are the, what's the equivalent of what we can do in software that is the, building the infrastructure to make the oil change and the pit stop faster?
Yeah, no, that's a good um, question. I mean, I probably won't have a comprehensive answer, but I'd say it
Mhm,
starts to me culturally, like we talked about, like that from the top, from the leadership. Everybody needs to understand. Everyone needs to understand that quality is something that we feel is important. So if you have engineers, so I've seen it in my career too, where if you've got a good engineering team, the engineering manager will not tolerate it if someone continues to ship garbage and you have to let that
mhm,
person go. It's sort of like that shows all of the other engineers like, oh wow, like this is serious. Like it's to the point. I'm not saying nobody likes to fire anyone, but there are certain people who just don't care about this stuff. And then if it's a cultural thing, that has to be addressed. But in terms of the product, I think starting at the engineering level, having the right unit tests and then the right mentality of like how we're building the code, proud of this code, and then it's got to have, integration testing. We've got to have the equivalent of like a QA server or a staging server for testing. It's got to have then a full, I'm not using the right terminology, but the full test where all the components are now, they've all individually been
Mhm.
tested, but now they need to be tested together to make sure we haven't created any interactions that are a problem, right? So this almost a way of, and all along the way, being able to monitor those tests. So you've got lots and lots of tests now from the unit level to the integration level, and having one place where I can see um, where those results are, like, and so that I
Mhm.
know that the code that I'm about to ship is quality, right? That I can send this
Mhm.
to production. And I feel like in my career, that's hard to know that
Yeah.
your software that you're about to ship is better than what's in production. That's really difficult. Software is complicated, and very few companies have good enough infrastructure in place to do that.
Mhm. Yeah. I'd like to go back to that point on leadership and culture because I think that's, based on my experience of working with many companies trying to get started with test automation and optimizing their existing test runs and things like that. It's amazing how much even small words from leadership can have a huge impact on quality.
Yeah,
And that comes down to just you could give lip service all day long to we think quality is important, write those automated tests. But if it comes down to a go, no go decision and there's a critical or high priority bug and you say, well, let's just ship it anyway this time, that one statement
yeah,
there seems like it can undo months worth of work in investing in quality
yep,
because right there you put your values on the line and you said, you know what, we would rather ship garbage than ship something that's high quality. Um,
yeah,
I
totally.
think another example of where I've seen that is, with how you estimate work. Do you estimate how much time it takes for writing the code and then separately estimate how much time it takes for writing the tests? Well, the only reason you would estimate them separately is if you're assuming that it's okay sometimes to do one and not the other.
Right.
If it's one unit of work and the team just says, hey, this is what's the expectation for doing the one unit of work, it has to have the tests, then the team can estimate this is what it's going to take to do the work every time. And I've seen teams fall into those kinds of traps. Or also do you do the combined sprint where developers and QA are working together, or maybe even the same role and you don't have separate dedicated roles? Or you do more of the staggered sprint approach where it's like, okay, the developers have their week, and then after that they pass it over the fence to QA, and QA has their week.
Yeah,
And that's another case of where it's like, okay, the reason you would do that is if some weeks you want to say, well, it's okay to just do the development work and not do the QA work, or sometimes it's
right.
okay to have people only focus in testing the new functionality and not going back and testing the regression functionality, and things like that. So I think it's hugely important what kind of culture you set up and how the leadership in the organization talks about quality and is willing to stand by it, even if it means they have to go back and tell somebody they made an external commitment to, hey, we respect you enough that we're not going to push crap into your
Yeah,
environment. It's going to delay our release a few days, but we want to make sure you have a good experience here. And I think especially for early startup founders, they they haven't gotten the guts to say no to
yeah,
customers
yeah.
yet, right? And I could say that because I've been a founder for my company for 6 years. We it's tough when you're dealing with a Fortune 500 company and they say, "Hey, we really need something by Wednesday," and then you get a blocking bug that comes up,
Yeah,
Wednesday morning, right? And
right.
yeah, you found it a little late. What do you do in that situation? And
Yeah,
if you're a bigger company, it's maybe easier to say no. But I think all of us kind of have that challenge at one point or another where we're really trying to meet a deadline and we know we said we were going to do it and we did everything right, but something big comes up at the last minute and it's really hard to have the courage to stick by your guns and say, yes, I'm gonna ship quality this time, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, agreed. I think a lot of companies think about culture and they try to figure out what should be in their culture and what they should write down. But I believe culture, I'm not going to get on a sidetrack of culture here, but I think it's the collective decisions that you make. And if you're making decisions like you said, where sometimes it's okay and we'll just this time we'll do it, then that sets the culture for the company, right? And
Mhm.
it's got to be one of those things that everyone gets. Like I know in the various places I've been before, my engineering team, if I wanted to push them hard, like, sure, they'll ship faster if they think that's what we need. But if we tell them we need to do the, slow down, do the quality, like your example, like build that into your schedule. Like, don't just give me a schedule to ship the code. Give me a schedule to ship the code and write the tests and walk it through. And I think that they just need to know what you want. So you have to be explicit about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to, for us to all realize that, software development is still a relatively new field. I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at some of
It's
the
way
fields that are
messier than
out
people
there,
than people think who don't know
yeah.
about software. It's like really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was less than a century ago that people were using punch cards and loading them into machines. And if you loaded
Yeah,
the punch cards in the wrong order, that was what caused your defects in the system, right?
right, right.
And so, when you compare our field to something like construction, uh, they're building a large skyscraper. And yes, construction technology has changed over time, but construction itself has been around since like the dawn of time. And they still encounter issues with, quality and timelines and planning. And so I think when it comes to software development, we need to acknowledge that there is a certain amount of uncertainty with what we do. And your options are, I can look for a certain outcome and make sacrifices in scope or make sacrifices in quality to hit that date. Or I can say, hey, the bar is going to be here. I'm not going to ship something if it doesn't have this amount of scope, or I'm not going to ship something if it doesn't have this level of quality.
Right.
And I'm willing for the date to be a little bit different because of that. Or I'm going to be smart about when I communicate the date, right? So I know we've all experienced that quality trap of, the young CEO who goes out there and says, yes, we're going to have it in 2 or 3 weeks, even though they haven't started building anything yet.
Yeah.
And then you get 2 weeks into it and you realize, wow,
This is
this
way
is,
bigger than we thought.
yeah, yeah. Versus the CEO who might hold off on telling them and set expectations appropriately, build a little bit first, get a little closer to the deadline before you lock in the date, right? Um,
Well, that brings up an interesting sort of dynamic too. Like I've been at companies that I would call are sales led. So many companies kind of have some of them are more, the founder's a product person. Some of them, they might be a salesperson or
mhm,
some of them might be a finance person, whatever. I've seen some organizations that are very good at sales and they're sales led. And then the salespeople go out and make these promises, right? And then the engineering is basically trying to just keep up with that. And that can be a problem where I think that, good quality product, someone has to have the power and the guts to do, like you said, and say, like, not only do we not ship this, but like this big feature that we're trying to ship, it's just not ready. Like, what if
mhm,
you had to delay that like 3 months or something? And the sales team's already promised this to the customer. I think, a good company needs to be able to make that call. And the
mhm.
person in the product seat needs to have the authority to say, look, we're not going to ship this because it's not going to do any good. This is not like, how it is. Like sometimes things just become bigger than we thought, or maybe some new externality comes in that changes the schedule. And I think that's important, for a company to be, and then the reality is
Mhm.
some people are working in companies that aren't willing to do that. So then you can't necessarily rip that feature out and redo it, but you still need to have some agency to be able to do the proper quality testing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that reminds me of a practice that I think is healthy for teams for improving quality. It's similar to the shift left concept, but it's a little different. And that's that a lot of modern engineering teams are having regular demos at the end of their sprints of here's what the engineering team got done this week. And I've seen it be hugely successful to invite the sales teams, invite the customer success team to go watch those demos,
Yeah.
because that helps give them an idea of, here's what the team is able to get done in a sprint.
Yep.
It gives them an opportunity to say, that's not going to fly with my customer base. And so much of delivering quality is, I think you mentioned this earlier, is about customer expectations and experience. And so if you're sharing with the sales teams and the customer success teams who are that front line of interfacing with the customer, what's new and what's upcoming, it gives them an opportunity to influence the quality of the result so that your customers are going to get a better experience.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's no doubt. I think that reminds me of there's a practice I read about at Apple when they build their software that I thought that has inspired me to do something similar in the past. They would say, I mean, you're talking about sprints, I think that's fine too, but when they were working on a high profile project, they had a demo day every Friday. And like
Mhm.
the engineering team, like no matter what they were working on, they had to show a demo many times to Steve Jobs or to the executive team on Fridays. So what was interesting about that is there's none of this, like you've probably seen this before, where the engineers sometimes are spinning on something and they're struggling with it, and then weeks can go by and you're like, where are you at? Well, we're almost there. It's like when they have to ship something every Friday or whatever, once a week or every 2 weeks, however you set it up. And then in particular, when you bring the CS team or the sales team, they get to see the progress, right? And they get an appreciation for what that engineering team's going through. I find that a very powerful way to build software is
Mhm.
that, and then the engineers, they can ask for help, or you can start to see how they're doing on something and get a much better read on when it's going to be ready. And everyone gets a better appreciation for what they're going through. So I like that practice a
Mhm.
lot.
Cool. Yeah, yeah, I think so. So so let's say you get to that point where, now you're realizing quality is starting to become a problem. You've
Yeah.
been moving too fast for too long, and it's time to really hone in on those practices and get quality in place.
Yeah.
What would you do as kind of your first steps for getting started? Having done it before, like if you had to do it again based on what you've learned, how
Yeah.
would you go about doing it today if you were doing it today?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, I think in my case, in my last company, we let it go a little too far, because we were running early stage, and then we had to pause development for like 3 months at new development.
Mhm.
And I would do that again. Like I would then, once I realized, okay, it's not just we got a few bugs. This was a trend, and you could tell because we had a good CS team that there were some significant bugs and they're getting more and more. So we were able to say, okay, let's put everything on pause here. The engineers were, out of breath anyway because they've been
Mhm.
sprinting so much trying to get features out that in some ways they welcomed that. And then we said, let's do that. First of all, I like that made a statement. Like, we've promised things to customers. We've been working on this new feature set for a while, but I'm willing to put everything on hold
Yeah.
while we fix it. So I think that was the first, is to send that message, how important it is. Then we went back, and what I would do is go back and review the bugs, the CS team and the engineering team together, not to point fingers, but to just to show, like, these are the bugs. This is the hours that it's costing the CS team. This is what the customer's going through. We want to deliver an excellent experience to our customers. So what do we need to do? Right? And asking them to enroll them in the problem. And then, well, we need
Mhm.
more time to bake into the schedule. Okay, fine. And then we would then back up and say, I would want the engineers I would have specific conversations with them about the unit testing, like, and when they're developing and coding, how they're talking to each other. And in our case, if I don't have a Q, I'm kind of going down the path if I don't have a dedicated QA team, right? Because
Mhm.
we didn't. So I would, do the pause, make sure everyone's understood how important it is, get the CS team and the engineering team going through some of the major bugs together. It doesn't have to be all of them, but so they're on the same page, right?
Mhm.
Then talk to the engineers about what do you need. Maybe they need some tools, maybe they need more time, but they definitely are responsible. Every single engineer is responsible um, for testing their code. And then
I,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
yeah, yeah. How do you think the developers responded? You said that in general they welcomed the change because they needed a bit of a breather. Uh, did anybody feel like it was a personal attack on the quality of their work, or feel like, yeah, somebody else should be responsible for testing? That's not my job. Like
Yeah,
what
good
what were kind
question.
of some of the different individualized
Yeah.
responses you got there?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So, first of all, I framed it in a way that said, I recognize that I've been pushing you guys really hard for a long time.
Mm,
So I started there, right? And said, we to collectively have gotten, we've ended up in this situation. I did not point my fingers at the engineering team and say, oh, you guys suck. You build all these bugs. It was like, no, this is how we've been operating. It's not working. We need to put it on pause and go back to the root and just listen to them because they'll tell you, right? Well, you guys made this decision or you added this huge feature and you added it into the schedule at the last minute, right? This always happens, things like that.
mm,
And I made, I think you have to listen. Now, I do also think that there are some engineers that they are they don't like to do that testing. Like they just want to move fast. And
mm.
you have to find out who those people are. Like my engineering manager was really good at that. And we had to let some people, not in this particular case. I mean, along the way after that, if somebody wasn't interested in testing their code and they kept shipping things that were bugs, the other engineers would get mad, right? Because
Mm.
they had bought into the vision of like what we're doing. And if someone
Yeah,
else kept injecting things that were blowing stuff up, they would get upset. And then if that person, you would give them plenty of time to change, but some people just can't, right? They've never really, their mind's not wired that way. And then we have to like part ways because we
yeah.
have to
I
have people that buy in.
yeah, I think that's really important for our audience to hear. I mean, this is the Developers Who Test podcast. The big secret is that all developers should test. And so if you're
100%.
not developers who test,
Yeah.
I think it's good to hear from, somebody who is the CEO of a tech company working with developers that, you got to the point where there was that expectation that as an engineer, as a developer, this is a thing you need to know how to do,
Yeah.
and need
And
to be
take
good
pride
at.
in it.
So
Like if you
yeah,
ship some code, like it should work, right?
yeah,
And most engineers do. There's this, they feel good about what they're creating and they know people are going to use it. I mean, that's from when I had written code, like that was the coolest thing in the world when you write some code that and you see people using your software. I mean, you get a
yeah.
rush out of that. And if it's great software, that's that's what we should all be shooting for, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've seen that there are two kinds of developers, generally speaking. Like there's the developers that are really motivated by wowing customers. And then there are the developers that like to take things apart and put them back together. And what I've seen is the developers who like wowing customers, they're the ones that crank out the features and they get really excited when there's some new widget that was really hard to build in some JavaScript library and the customer sees it and their eyes light up a little bit, and that's really what motivates them. And then others who really want to understand at a deep level how the system works. And the ones who tend to be better about shipping features quickly are the ones who like to wow the customers. The ones who tend to be better about quality are the ones who like to take things apart and put them back together. And I think as as leaders of early stage startups or even later stage startups, or really any company, it's important for us to think about, what's that mix on my team? Do I have enough of the people
Right.
who like to wow the customer? And do I have enough of the people who like to take it apart, put it back together so that I'm going to have a healthy balance and
Right.
be able to ship software quickly, but still make sure that it works properly?
Yeah, no, totally agree. And to round out the question of what would I do? Beyond that would be once you've got, you know, the developers doing the unit tests and that they're buying into this mission and you're going to give them time in the schedule to do that. Then there's this whole sort of like a staging production server kind of infrastructure that takes some time to set up. If I mean, some companies are just shipping right to production, right? And so you
Mhm.
have to have some integration test area and ideally some tool to monitor your tests, right? So if you've got all of these tests that are running, so you got the engineers doing their unit tests, they feel good about their code. Now you put it all together, many features coming together. Now there should be some automated tests that are going through, taking paths through the integrated software. And
Mhm.
I would make sure I had a way to see the results of those tests, right? So that I could
Yeah.
then have and I may need to develop, like we need to develop time to create a new test run through the software because we've integrated a new feature, right? And so I need to have a report that can tell me, well, or the engineering manager in charge of the release or the product manager, like, hey, we ran these tests. And so we know at least these features work. Or if we
Mhm.
fail, now we've got a process to go back and fix that. And so that's something that I would definitely do as part of this is like make sure I felt good about the integration test and that we could constantly add and refine the test coverage of our software. Because in
Mhm.
reality, you never have 100% test coverage of your software, right? But you got to get to the point where you feel some level of confidence that what you're shipping is going to all hang together when it goes out in production.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah, so you were in a situation where, you being the CEO recognized you wanted to do something differently. You were able to communicate that with the team. So it was really kind of a top-down approach of, hey, we need to do something differently here.
I would say that
Uh,
it was top down. Like I was able to help vocalize it, but it wasn't really top down because our
right.
CS team wanted
Right.
it. Like everybody wanted it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, but where I'm going with this is, what if you're the developer who's at that company
yeah,
where you never get time to do the testing and customers are complaining you're spending 50% of your time working on bugs? It's really not a fun place to be.
right.
But your CEO isn't Don Campbell, is one of the CEOs that's like, I don't care, let's just keep going. We got to keep going. We got to keep going. Uh, how would you, as a developer, take that back to your business leadership and make the case for, hey, now we need to invest more in quality and test automation and getting these processes in place?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and that's a tough spot to be in, no doubt about it. I think though, what I have seen people do in the past when I've been at companies that maybe I wasn't the CEO and I was working there, and I saw some engineers are really good at like establishing a reputation for their code and themselves. They take pride in it. And I like if that was me, what I would do is make sure that my code was always solid and then I had a way to show that I was doing that test, almost kind of lead by example. And then
Mhm.
I would just try to enroll the other engineers in it. Now it's not always possible, but I think though that I've seen this work before where people, a lot of other engineers look up to certain engineers, right? It's just like any group of people. There's some people that stand out, and I think kind of taking a strong point of view is like it's a good thing. And I've seen that
Yeah.
work where maybe an engineer says, "Hey, this is how I do it, and here's why my stuff always works," and they obviously take pride in that. And then they start getting noticed even outside of engineering, and they get more and more credibility and influence over the process.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a really, it's a really cool thing to see. Technical leadership doesn't come with a title, uh,
yeah, yeah. That's
always,
right.
right? And
Yeah,
so it is really cool when you're a senior engineer, being able to grab the wheel and start providing technical leadership to your team with
yeah,
or without the title, and how that can make a huge impact on how your team operates. And over time, like, trust me, if you're that person, then you do start to get noticed, and that's how you
yeah.
get the promotions,
Hmm.
becoming team lead and then director of
Right.
engineering, working your way on up is through doing things like that. I think, with a lot of developers, having been one for so many years, a lot of us are people pleasers. We're achievers and we want to have the customers be excited about what we're building, and we want our managers to be happy with our performance. We want to get perfect performance reviews. And I think because of that, sometimes we're hesitant to step up and take a stand and say, like, no, I'm not going to ship something that's garbage tomorrow, right?
Right.
or even if not that firm, you can always at least question it. In most company environments, there's a healthy way of saying, okay, why do we need to have the deadline this time, right? Is
Yeah.
there an external commitment here? And some of the best engineers I've worked with, they don't just accept the arbitrary deadline as, oh, I've got to ship something that's garbage by this date because they said this was the deadline. They ask those follow-up questions. They say, okay, do you have this deadline because you just want us to move fast? Do you have it because you've communicated it externally? Is there some big deal that's hanging in the balance on this? And I think having that extra context as an engineer can help you make better decisions for the business in terms of like what you should or shouldn't ship. Because I hate when people are just too absolutist about, yeah, we should never ship unless the code coverage is 95%
Right.
and
Right.
we have automated tests around constant variables.
Yeah.
uh, you
Yeah.
know, when, especially in startups, I mean, sometimes in a startup, you really can have, there's a big renewal, and if the feature is not there for the big renewal, you're going to be in a situation where you're laying off 25% of your staff. It would be kind of silly to not do everything you possibly can to get something into production so that you still have a company. And I think sometimes like the founders, they're feeling that stuff, but they don't want to communicate it to their engineering teams. And sometimes the engineering teams are feeling like, oh, I've just got to commit to whatever because I want to be that good developer that commits to whatever and does it. And sometimes the threat really is there, but a lot of times it's just, hey, I just want to go as fast as we can, and maybe it's not communicated well, or maybe they didn't realize they were supposed to ask for an estimate before giving a time commitment.
Yeah.
And that's part of a startup, is just figuring out how to get those things to run smoothly, right?
Yeah. To illustrate that in the extreme, one company I worked at earlier in my career when I was a product manager, the they had the first time I worked with outsourced developers, and they're not going to name any country. I don't want to pick on any because I think there's excellent developers everywhere. But for a while, like outsourcing was this really exciting thing, and you could get 10 engineers for the price of one or whatever. But what I found was like I would be the product manager and I would say, okay, this is what we need to do. And then they would just go, okay. Like they never challenged me on anything. And what I
Hmm.
was used to in previous places that I could actually put it out there and the engineer would be like, well, what if we did it this way, then we could do it faster. Or like, that's not a very good idea because of this, right? And that back and forth where the engineers were engaging in a discussion around the best way to do it. Now, and some people cross that line too far, right? That you've got to find the right balance. But that really struck me that I had these engineers that would then just go off and not ask any questions and come back like later with something. I'm like, well, that's not really what I want. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like
Yeah.
that kind of illustrates your point. Is like I think that all engineers should feel like, hey, that if you want to do it that way, I need more time because of this, right? There's got to be this ability to challenge. Now, I've seen some engineers just are pain to work with because they think everyone else is stupid and they just try and challenge everything, and that's not the way to do it either. But I do think engineers should have the voice. They should be in a culture where they can speak up and say like to your point, be able to go back and forth and challenge these things. Now, the other thing I've seen is I've had engineers where I've had to say like, look, um, it's okay to to take more time with this if you need to. Like, I kind of lost my point there. It's like some engineers, they need to, like, they want to please, like you said earlier, they want to do the right thing, they want to please you. So you have to tell them, like, this, I don't want to know, like, how can you do this? Yeah, that'll take me a day. Okay, now let's think about this in a different way. Can you do that, build this code and test and integrate in with the rest of the product? Like, that's not a
Mhm.
day, and I know it. Let's talk about, like, they tend to
Yeah.
think in terms of, oh yeah, that's, they think of just the technical challenge of getting that thing done and not the testing of it and putting it as part of the product.
Mhm.
So that's like the other side of it is, I think I've had to train certain people to say, don't give me that answer. Like, think through all the other pieces of it first, you
Mhm.
know?
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation. I think it's really important for developers who test to think about the context of the entire organization, having some of that business context and being able to ask intelligent questions of your management,
Right.
communicate to them when emphasizing quality needs to become more of a thing that happens, then that can be really healthy for your organization. It's never too early to get started with thinking about quality and testing and get that in place. And based on my experience, the sooner you do it, the easier and less expensive it is to get in place, and the more you start reaping the benefits sooner. So, Don Campbell, definitely appreciate having you on the show. A lot of great insights. You've got a really amazing background and have really given our developers who test something to think about. So thank you for coming and hope you had a good time.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. My pleasure.
All right.